Judy Gearhart, and I am a senior researcher at the Accountability Research Center here at American University. And before I start the formal presentation, I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to let people know that we're going to be recording this, since you just all saw that. Those people online, if you didn't, I hope that's okay with everybody. And I think we will now move to share screen. And I'll get this going. Okay, thank you. So human rights and environmental due diligence practicing is very much a two-way street, as you can see from the tech support that I get all the time from this group. And we're using a new software. It's Prezi, so it's not PowerPoint as I'm used to, which is old school. I'm tremendously grateful to Ian Urbina from the Outlaw Ocean Project for joining us, and to Ann Zollner, who just returned from being abroad in Europe, and she's going to be joining us online to give us a commentary on the Department of Labor and their perspectives on this research. So with that, let me give you a sense of what this research is about. So the Fishery Governance Project is our client. So the students here who are sitting up front, and we'll present them by each research team. The Fishery Governance Project started in 2019, and it is a collaboration of funders and practitioners working together to look at both environmental issues and labor rights issues in the seafood industry. We're trying to figure out how to speak the same language a lot of the times, and also where there's overlap. How does one field help the other? And you're going to hear more about this today, and where there's some shortcomings in some of the previous thinking about that. So the steering committee at the moment for the Fishery Governance Project is made up of Packard Foundation, Oak Foundation, Walton Family Foundation, USAID, the Accountability Research Center, my former organization, the Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum, Pew, Charitable Trusts, and the Environmental Justice Foundation. This project is really serving one of the three working groups of the Fishery Governance Project. We've divided up the work into looking at treaties and governance on the oceans. And then there's another working group looking at enforcement and victim protection, where we're really trying to do the kind of research that for the Accountability Research Center is our sweet spot, looking at what are grassroots, national and local organizations saying about the solutions for protecting fishers and fishery workers around the globe. The third working group is the markets working group. And the markets working group is the one that asks the practicum to give input to look at both how are the laws evolving in human rights and environmental due diligence requirements by different countries and regions, and then also looking at what are some of the practices being taken up by the market. So just a word, the way we've set this up is the Accountability Research Center is providing a little additional support, basically tying in my body of research with the research of the Fishery Governance Project. And just the introductions to the panel, we have Victoria Latham, who will be presenting on the legal analysis. Connor Moynihan will present on the market, the corporate practices, and Sloan Harden, who's going to present on the civil society organizations and their perspectives. And then we'll ask Anne and Ian to comment. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Victoria to talk about what is human rights and environmental due diligence and the legal analysis to date. Thank you. You don't know, there's a little
Hi everyone, my name is Victoria Latham. I work team with Laura for the legal analysis, but I'll also kind of start with a brief overview of our practicum and the three teams. So our goal for this practicum was to advance the human rights and environmental due diligence in the seafood industry. And for those of you that don't know, we'll be using HREDD. And human rights and environmental due diligence is the process for companies to efficiently identify, prevent, and mitigate negative impacts on their activities on the environment and human rights. So for the Fisheries Governance Project, we had three living goals. to assess the key points of debate around the current HRED laws and treaties, to identify business practices and responses to the demands for more rigorous HRED, and to analyze how these practices can form advanced supply chain protections and what the civil societies are asking. So to kind of to analyze these three, we had three teams: the legal, corporate, and CSO. And we kind of used a lens moving off of last year's practicum, which showed that we need to focus more on remedy as a whole. And to do that, we use grievance mechanisms and the recruitment process and looked deeper into those issues. So a little kind of why. The oceans and the seafood industry, like why we're looking at this. The oceans are one of the largest carbon sinks in the world and produce over 50% of the world's oxygen. Over 3 billion people rely on fish protein and there are millions of workers employed on the oceans. But there are a lot of human rights abuses going on in the seafood industry that are kind of often left out of the talk. And so there's an unsure number, but around 32,000 to 100,000 casualties per year out on the oceans. And there's, forced labor, violence at sea, horrid living and working conditions. And there's no kind of agreed upon way to govern all of this. And so that is really the task for us, is figure out how can we best solve these issues and get remedy for victims. So so these two issues really kind of culminate in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or IUU fishing, and environmental degradation on the environmental side, and then there's the human rights violations. And so these two kind of issues combined can be governed by human rights and environmental due diligence practices. Okay, so like I had mentioned, we're using kind of three main lenses, which is recruitment and looking at things like fees, debt bondage, modern day slavery, and how people are having to pay for their jobs, which we and a lot of the people in this field just don't agree with. Next is kind of grievance and how we need grievance mechanisms and complaints procedures for victims to kind of voice their needs. And then finally, remedy. What are the legal actions and remediation that we can do? And so now to start the kind of legal team analysis, I worked with Carla, Olivia, and Sue, who are out in the audience. And we kind of looked at the EU versus the US approach. So as kind of later the corporate team will talk about, a lot of HRED practices and corporate responsibility is voluntary. But one area, specifically the EU, is really trying to make mandatory laws. And so we looked a lot at those, and then versus the US approach, which does things a bit differently with deterrence and sanctions mechanisms. And then under these, we looked at certain laws and cases. And our goal is to assess the key points of debate around these issues and kind of try to see if there's a path that is working better, a path forward, and what changes need to be made. And methodologies, we were a research team of 4 and mostly did kind of a comprehensive literature review of laws and cases. Really looking at the EU approach versus the US approach. The EU approach uses things that create mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, regional and national level laws. And they often include a pathway to court and victim remedy in that way. They really are focusing on setting up like clear institutions that will work, but oftentimes we're seeing them fall short currently. And the US approach on the other side kind of has a little bit more of the teeth. They have deterrence mechanisms and sanctions that work kind of in a massive matrix to kind of try to protect businesses and protect the US from having illegal goods coming in. But there is no pathway for victim remedy here. So if we're finding goods being produced by forced labor, something's happening to the company, but nothing is happening for the victims and for the people in that forced labor situation. So we looked at the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which this field is really fast-paced and ever-changing. And so during our research, this was a proposed law, and it has now undergone votes just in April and is starting to move forward on the implementation phase. But this law aims to establish mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence obligations for corporations across global value chains. and is looking to kind of put a large EU perspective on companies integrating due diligence, companies having to establish complaints, procedures, and mechanisms, and creating pathways for victim remedy. What is going? Okay, so interestingly, it's pretty new, we're kind of looking at some pros and cons, and are hoping to kind of have this research expanded in the future as it kind of starts to get implemented. But some good parts about it is it will apply to EU companies, but also non-EU companies that are part of parent companies of the EU and subsidiaries. So there's a lot of places in which the law has some loopholes because companies are operating but not governed in those areas. And so this will kind of hopefully help fix some of that. There will be grievance mechanisms in place, and it's adding in sanctions. And so that is kind of, it's interesting for our team because that's the US approach, is using deterrence and sanctions, which is something that we thought the EU and other laws should start to incorporate. And so this might be kind of one of the first times that it incorporates both, but hasn't started yet. So we need to keep eyes on that. But some cons, there was discussion about the burden of proof is on victims to prove that they were experiencing abuse instead of on companies to prove that they did not do it. And that burden of proof was not switched. So it's still on the victims, which is a major problem. And then there's also potential for some corporate loopholes to then rely on social auditing instead of like real legal practice. Next, we looked at the French duty of vigilance law, which is a more national level law. It's considered one of the strongest in the region, I mean, kind of everywhere, for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And it requires companies to publish annual vigilance plans to establish effective measures to identify and mitigate human rights and environmental abuses. And you can put a company on formal notice that their vigilance plan is not strong enough or they're not following it. And then if they do not react, you can take them to court. A vigilance plan, for example, has things like risk mitigation and prevention, alert mechanisms, monitoring systems, things like that. There have been 7 cases filed under the law so far, and we looked at all of them. There's only one that has had a decision made, which is the Total Energies, and they have 2 cases, but the one in Uganda recently reached a decision in 2023 while we were researching, but unfortunately it was dismissed, was kind of the decision on procedural grounds, because the law was written with a couple loopholes in it, and the court wasn't kind of verified which court should take it on until 2021. And this case started in 2019, moved around a lot. And so by the time it came to the end in 2023, the court kind of felt like they didn't have the grounds to keep working on it. And there wasn't enough, like they hadn't gone back and done all of the procedures again as necessary over the 4 or 5 years it had been in court. So it was dismissed. So there's still kind of clearly a lot of flaws in this law. And of these other 6 cases, none of them have seen justice so far, and they've all kind of been in the court system since 2019, 2020. So it takes also a very long time if you're waiting on kind of help for your human rights abuses, or your land has been taken away, or all these things. That's a long time to wait. So then on the other side, we looked at the US approach, and the US has kind of had an increased focus on IUU fishing and human rights protection, with the White House memorandum on kind of the Biden administration's focus on fishing and labor rights abuses, and the NOAA proposed rule to ideally bring human rights abuses under the definition of IUU fishing. Those 2 things could be very important in how we can monitor seafood, hopefully monitor human rights abuses better, and have some of these sanctions and deterrence mechanisms kind of work in favor of human rights as well, and not just the goods, like the good supply chain. So some of the mechanisms we looked at more closely were things like the Tariff Act, the Global Magnitsky Act, and the Seafood Import and Monitoring Program. And all that has been a much longer report. But the Seafood Import and Monitoring Program we thought was interesting. If labor abuses is brought under IUU, then hopefully some of these monitoring programs that are going on with vessels tracking the goods and kind of their supply chain, and when there's illegal fishing happening, then hopefully you can also track what labor is being used to do said fishing and kind of follow that supply chain as well. And then some of the cases we looked at were the Bumblebee case, which was brought under the DC Consumer Protection Act and was not the same as like a deterrence or sanctions, but it was false labeling for a fair and safe supply chain. We thought this case was interesting because this company had to remove their labeling, but it also shined kind of a light on them and brought them to the table to talk about some of the mechanisms like Wi-Fi that we will talk about later in the presentation. The Rother case we thought was important to note because while it was dismissed because the US didn't feel like they had kind of the grounds to take the case, there was like a rallying of NGOs around it that said that the law was misread, and that by dismissing this case, the courts kind of went against the US's goals of reducing labor abuses. And then finally, the Dalian/Pigtan Marine Enterprises case was global sanctioning. The US sanctioned 157 vessels here against forced labor and IUU fishing. And this was important. It was the first time a company on the NASDAQ stock exchange has been sanctioned, which kind of shows the US like seriousness of the economic sanctions. And so finally, our group has worked a lot on this together, and we kind of feel that the best kind of approach is to take the EU approach of like growing proper institutions and the pathway to victim remedy, and combine that with the US sanctions and deterrence model and kind of web of approach like laws that they use and combine them together. And so there is a chance that the CSDDD EU directive that we spoke of could start to do this, but not sure. So we would advise that in the future research. And now we'll invite Connor.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, just Connor, please tell us about the corporate practices and how that's coming along. And I should just note, Victoria and her team have been looking at these laws as they change in real time. So it's a moving target.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Victoria. As they said, my name is Connor Moynihan. I am presenting on behalf of the corporate team, which I was privileged to research with Kylie Nivens, Heather Mullen, and Kelsey Allen Rodriguez. So this is our very quick agenda. We're going to go through our research today, talk a little bit about pre-competitive platforms, some gaps in particular on transparency, recruitment, and remedy in this space. And then we'll talk about some technologies that might be trying to fill some of those gaps. And then we'll take you through some recommendations, and then I'll hand it right over to Sloan. So our research for the Fisheries Governance Project covered 4 questions. First, what are companies doing in this space? Next, how are pre-competitive platforms affecting company action? Third, what are the gaps in, like I said, transparency, recruitment, and remedy? And finally, how can technology fill those gaps? So we were basing this on some of the uptake research we found from last year's 2022 practicum report. And we used the following methods to investigate these questions. First, we did open public research.
Sorry.
Okay. Sorry about that, folks online. So we did open source research looking at 40 companies' ESG and modern slavery statements, all of whom were associated with a pre-competitive platform. We also conducted interviews with human rights practitioners and associates of those pre-competitive platforms. And finally, we sent out a survey to the 31 member companies of Sea Alliance, which is one of those pre-competitive platforms, and got 13 responses. As far as what companies are doing, by and large, it is voluntary and market-based, as you heard in the legal presentation. We chose to focus on pre-competitive platforms as one of the actions that they are taking, which is joining these groups that discuss issues important to them before they bring their goods to market. We found that pre-competitive platforms certainly have really powerful potential for information sharing. This is going to be evident in these policies where you can see some uptake of the different issue areas. However, some companies in those platforms we heard in interviews are using concerns about antitrust to not share quite as much as they could. And we think that dampens the potential of those pre-competitive platforms. So one of our big recommendations here is that pre-competitive platforms should get some legal guidance teams to go over the antitrust litigation, what might trip antitrust litigation, so that companies will really be able to unleash that information sharing potential. Now, we focused on Sea Alliance and CBOS because they had a slightly more robust human rights regime than the other approximately 16 pre-competitive platforms in that space. Most of them will focus here on the seafood supply chain, so from harvest to your plate. But we thought it was really important to talk about the labor seafood supply chain. So this follows a worker from their source state through transit states and recruitment agencies to deep sea, back to port, and in theory, repatriated back to their homes. And we think this focus is important because if a company doesn't know their labor supply chain, they can't do true and good human rights due diligence. So we focus, as I said, on recruitment, which is relevant to the first part of the supply chain, transparency and grievance and remedy throughout the supply chain. On transparency, one of our major findings from our survey was that 9 out of the 13 respondents, so about 70%, know who their vessels are. This is really important because when we were doing our open source research on those 40 ESG and modern slavery statements, there were lots of commitments to transparency, and so we know companies agree that this is important, but very few of them actually published even tier 1 suppliers, let alone their vessel lists. Going over to recruitment, we also found in our survey that about a quarter of our respondents know who their manning agencies, so a lot fewer know that information. So even if they wanted to be transparent about it, maybe they would have some issues. But our main focus here was on the employer pays principle. Basically, the idea that the employer should be the one footing the bill for any recruitment costs incurred by those workers, right? Most of the companies, about half, prohibit recruitment fees in their supply chains, but very few can really evidence that this is happening. In our survey and interviews, we found that feasibility concerns like information and money were major concerns for those companies. And we also found that their preferred method of addressing recruitment would be through regulation at the state level. And finally, turning to grievance and remedy, a good number of over half of our companies that we did that public research on have some sort of grievance mechanism in their supply chain. Most of those are a whistleblowing hotline, and we know that there are some issues with that. So we asked companies in our survey, would Wi-Fi be of assistance to your grievance mechanisms? And 11 out of 13 support guaranteed Wi-Fi, and 9 out of 13 say it would indeed improve their grievance mechanisms. And this is important because this is a major campaign of the GLJ ILRF, the support the Wi-Fi for fishers now. In addition to improving grievance mechanisms, which we know companies agree with, we also want to highlight that having access to Wi-Fi allows fishers to talk to their families. They can check if payments are being received. And so there are a lot of mental health and social capital benefits to this movement as well. And finally, turning to technology very briefly. The major technology in fisheries monitoring is satellites, so AIS and VMS. I'm sure most of you have heard of those technologies. But we wanted to focus a little bit more on the problem of beneficial ownership. So this is the idea that the owner of the vessel may not be the person listed on a corporate registry. There may be several layers between the owner or the ultimate owner and the vessel. And there also may be several vessels owned by the same person or network, that some of which are perfectly fine and others of which are doing some nefarious things. So we were able to beta test a new fisheries monitoring tool called Triton, which is by the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, C4ADS. And this is what a search might return on a specific vessel. So if you're a company, because that's our perspective on this report, you might be doing business with vessel 1, and vessel 4 might be engaging in IUU fishing. So you as a company, if you have access to Triton, can then see not only the vessels, but the companies and the people and some relationships in between, anywhere from registered owner to officer to shareholder, and even in some cases, family members. This is a potentially really powerful tool because, again, you can take your entire business away from the network that is supporting nefarious activity. But it's that very power that is a bit of a double-edged sword. So that brings me to our recommendations, because the reason it's a double-edged sword is that companies can withdraw from those networks without any accountability for themselves or really making any of the situations better for the fishers on those vessels. So the first thing that we recommend is that companies need to publish their vessel lists. We know that some of them know them, and any that don't should be putting that effort in to find out who they are. In addition, they should be not only committing to the employer pays principle, but engaging in feasibility studies to truly understand what the costs, both informationally and financially, it would be to implement that principle and make sure that nobody has to pay for a job. And finally, they should support the GLJ ILRF's movement to guarantee fishers access to Wi-Fi, and they should write that into their contracts because they can then guarantee that and make that more of a norm rather than a special situation. And that is the presentation from the corporate side between Victoria and I. That was a very top-down view of this space. I'm going to hand it over to Sloan, who's going to talk a little bit more about the bottom up and the civil society perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Connor. That was a fantastic presentation. I always love listening to you speak. So like you said, my name is Sloan. I was part of the civil society team alongside Sam McGovern and Matthew Ridgway. And again, we did take a very bottom-up approach with this. So as we go through this presentation, it's just a couple more things. We're going to go over our research and what our questions were, our findings in terms of recruitment, our findings in terms of grievance redress. We bring forward a bit of a criticism when it comes to gender and its incorporation into this field. And then we wrap up with our recommendations, the top 3 from our report. So with that said, what were we looking at? Well, we wanted to know what CSO's top demands were in the issues of recruitment and grievance remedy. And we wanted to know how gender was incorporated within that work. To do that, we had a 2-pronged approach. First, we started with open source research where we compared over 20 different civil society organizations' reports and documents to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, specifically their effectiveness criteria for grievance mechanisms, as well as the ILO's general principles and operational guidelines for fair recruitment. We then coupled that work with 8 semi-structured interviews from the CSOs you see on the screen, mostly over Zoom, though a couple of the consultations were through email just due to scheduling conflicts. So with that said, a lot of our work focused on migrant workers and the unique issues that they face within the recruitment process and also access to remedy. So as we dive into the recruitment findings, we're going to highlight 3 themes that we found that CSO's demands kind of coalesced around as we mapped them against the ILO principles. First up, we have worker contracts. Now, workers' contracts are frequently substituted, manipulated, or just outright not provided in a language the worker can understand. And as you can see from the statistics on the screen, it just leads to a massive issue with clarity and understanding. So civil society organizations are actually demanding that there be better clarity in workers' contracts and that workers are able to give consent freely and with full information. One of the initiatives that we actually found that aims to help with this is called Diligence, to digitalize workers' contracts and trace any changes made to them through technology. So if there is a change, a substitution, there's a record of it and it increases transparency and accountability. Up next, we have recruitment fees and debt bondage. You might recognize this quote if you have listened to the Outlaw Ocean podcast. But so what we see is that recruitment agencies frequently charge absolutely insane fees, from visas to passports to housing, even food. And it can lead to workers owing money long after the contract is done. So as you heard from the corporate team, CSOs actually also support the employer pays principle and are pretty adamant about the reduction of worker fees in the process. One initiative that we found was by Thai Union, who started a pilot project with migrants from Myanmar to help ensure ethical recruitment by creating an in-house recruitment division. They supported the employer pays principle, though through an interview that we had during our work, it seems like they've scaled back due to the associated costs. It's an interesting scenario and one that's definitely worth like keeping an eye on and watching and seeing how it unfolds going forward. Last but not least, in terms of recruitment, we have the demand for freedom of movement. Skippers and vessel managers frequently confiscate workers' documents, so visas, passports, so on and so forth, and then use it to manipulate a migrant's fear of deportation or detention to keep them bound to their work. So civil society organizations call for probably what you've assumed by now is for workers to retain their documents and to help balance out that power dynamic between an employer and employee. This means that workers are then able to come and go off the ship where they're legally allowed to. They do not have to fear being abandoned at port without the appropriate documents. And they are able to better just select where they want to work should they find themselves in an abusive situation. With that said, so we have these workers that are out at sea, they are risking life and limb, and frequently they're not getting justice for this, they or their families, should that be all that is left, unfortunately. And that brings us directly to grievance redress. So we mapped the civil society organizations' reports and documents against the UNGP's effectiveness criteria for grievance mechanisms. And we found 5 key principles that they seem to center around. We have accessibility, safety and trust, effectiveness, accountability, and most importantly, worker participation. And instead of going through all of these and listing out the nitty-gritty details, in sum, what that means when you add them all together is that companies need to incorporate workers into the negotiation process of establishing a legally binding grievance redress mechanism. This means that they are working with worker-driven social responsibility, incorporating worker voice, and it is a process that actually has required outcomes. As you heard from the corporate team and to an extent the legal team, a lot of what's going on is voluntary, it's unenforceable. And so by making it legally binding, you are ensuring that these workers are getting access to remedy in the way that they need. Following that up, though, civil society organizations are also looking for more enforceable legislation. So HREDD, yeah, laws really do need those teeth that the legal team was looking for. As a class, we seem to fully agree on that. And as we went through our research, we found that civil society organizations are running up against that barrier of being able to promote a lot from the ground up, but with no top-down enforceability, it leaves a murky gray area for operations. But also, as it stands, companies still need to engage with workers' organizations and trade unions to create that accountability from the ground up. You can't just rely on the top down. And so by marrying the two approaches, you're going to have the most effective human rights and environmental due diligence processes within the seafood industry. That does wrap up the grievance and recruitment section. And we're going to look at, again, what we have labeled a criticism. So if you remember our 2 research questions, it was what were we looking at in terms of recruitment and grievance? And how is gender represented? And quite frankly, it is not. What you have is you have a very vessel-centered debate, and vessels are predominantly male. I should say deep water vessels, to be more specific. And that leaves the question of what about women? And when we're looking at migrant workers, what about migrant women? When you're a migrant, you have issues like running into language barriers, not knowing your rights because you're in a different country, or just having different rights than a native worker. Versus when you're a woman, you have issues such as having less general education, having the burden of reproductive work and household care, and also possibly being the victim of sexual and gender-based violence in the workplace. When you are both a migrant and a woman, you have both. You have a higher barrier to being able to access justice, and which means you have unique considerations that need to be taken into account. One of the most striking examples that really drives this point home is from a Plan International report that describes the process of a migrant family getting their visas and then later renewing them. So in violation of the employer pays principle, companies take money back out of their workers' paychecks to compensate for the visas. And that leaves the family a year later when they need to renew short on money. The family only has enough to renew one, and the man working on a vessel making more money gets his visa renewed, and the woman does not, leaving her now an undocumented migrant who is more vulnerable to her already exacerbated vulnerabilities. It is a very unique issue that you wouldn't find unless you were looking specifically at that intersection of migrant women. It's also worth noting in the same report that the women that were surveyed wanted to work on these deep water vessels and were barred from it due to gendered expectations that men were more reliable, harder working, and just generally stronger. So it's not necessarily a lack of interest that keeps them from there, but a societal pressure that is drawing a hard line. And this is important to note because in the solutions that are being presented, we're lacking that nuance and that intersectionality. We're promoting, as we've seen thus far in this work, a very gender-blind universal approach that just doesn't quite work. So one of the best ways to approach it, it's not the easiest, of course, is to collect and disaggregate data based on race, gender, age, ability status, so on and so forth. Because what we really need both companies, countries, and CSOs to realize is that universal policy in the name of the gender-blind worker only work if you have all vulnerabilities considered from the initial analysis. Otherwise, you are excluding groups and you're not even aware of it. And with that, we are going to highlight the top 3 recommendations from our report and move on. Number 1, we have pushing for electronic documentation technologies for worker contracts to increase transparency and accountability for contract understanding, manipulation, or substitutions. Number 2, we have ensuring that workers and trade unions have a meaningful role in the design, implementation, and evaluation of legally binding grievance redress mechanisms. And 3, we have apply an intersectional lens of analysis and a gender transformative approach to HREDD work in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connor, Victoria, and Sloan. And I have to do a real sincere personal thanks to Sloan because she pushed us to include the gender piece. I thought she was absolutely right. And we made the space, and Sam and Matt, who were on her team, also agreed to make the space and the research to add that, and sort of like doubled the amount of research they did. And they've all done a tremendous amount. So I'd love to give a round of applause. The whole team of practicum students are here in the front row. And if we could just say thank you. So with that, I'm going to ask Ann Zollner from the U.S. Department of Labor. She's Division Chief for Trade Policy and Negotiations to provide some commentary about any part of the presentation she'd like to, especially about the legal team's analysis of the hybrid and the need to match the EU sort of teething process with the US deterrence process. But of course, I'm sure you've looked at these issues from many sides, so we'd love to hear your perspectives from however you want to take it.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Judy. And hi, I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but many congratulations to Sloan, Connor, and Victoria on this very important and timely work on so many levels. It really fits with a lot that the U.S. government has, working through various interagency initiatives, as well as our work with other country partners. And as Judy said at the beginning, I just returned shortly late last week from the Global Seafood Expo in Barcelona, and tried to take this conversation to that another level within that forum, and we're really truly benefited from having one of the Wi-Fi Indonesian fisher workers on our panel. So really brought that message back to the audience there at the Global Seafood Expo, and had an opportunity to do a private sector roundtable with some business folks. But again, to some degree, I'll be candid, felt like I was speaking to the same audience, sympathetic audience over and over, and was continue to be struck by how do we reach the fullest private sector audience and get their attention in the way we know best. So I have a few reflections. One of the things that we know, did I just do something? No. Is true is that whether it's the US or the EU or Australia or UK, both, all legislators and consumer are calling for more transparency and accountability and traceability in their supply chains. It's taking these different forms, whether it's the EU's human rights due diligence models or the US sort of sanction-based approach. There is more of a government and consumer call for this. So I think that's a really important thing to note. And in our comments, whether it was in Boston or in Barcelona, we've really called on the private sector to know their human labor supply chain in the same way that they know their conservation and environmental supply chain, which is reflective of some of the points that Connor and Victoria and Sloan made just a bit ago, that we are saying you are far better served knowing your supply chain early on and fully, lest you find yourselves in a situation that is having you face some kind of a sanction approach. So I'm deeply appreciative of the point you've made about marrying the two models, because it seems from where I sit that the human rights due diligence by itself is insufficient for some of the reasons that the team reflected. The fact that there is some, continue to be some voluntary dimensions to it, and that it doesn't sort of fully guarantee the fullest grievance and while there are grievance and remedies available, that's not to my mind, there are ways that there can be sort of skirting around it. So there's a little bit of concern on my part. And yet at the same time, the US approach of sanctions process is whether it's withhold and release orders or GLOMAG or other or our trade tools, these are very blunt instruments. And so from our perspective, one of the things that's really useful to us is if there can be more of a signaling up front, and then a movement to, giving actors some space to sort of know what they need to sort of do to resolve these issues. And then if they fail to sort of improve or make redress, that then there is a sanction consequence. So one of the things that I know is also true is that, businesses want consistency. They want the rules for their own operating procedures. They want the rules to be established and clear and, out there, so everyone's meeting the same things. And right now, what we have in this industry is so clearly not that. And I think that's a really important thing to sort of reflect upon as we proceed into this space. I'll just sort of, I guess, wrap up and say that, there's a real need for industry action, government action, and the continued worker voice that the students reflected so accurately, that they need to be part of the solutions as we bring in, and whether it's binding agreements or things like the Fair Food Program brought to the ocean space, the seafood space. These are some of the things that I continue to want to take forward in our work from the US government perspective. But let me stop there.
Thank you, Anne. And I have to recognize we have a number of experts in the room and also quite a few online. But I want to turn to Ian now. And I have to say, if you haven't read the Outlaw Ocean book, you should, because it's really one of the best reads out there. And I think it has helped, it certainly helped me in various years to galvanize students to take a deeper interest in this field. And I think I think if I can say, Ian, one of the parts of your mission is to really help pull more people into this work because there's a big need. So thank you.
Thanks for that. You go to these events or at least I do, and whether I'm up at the podium or behind a table, I'm often like in this state of panic where I'm like, okay, any second now the idea is going to bubble up, and I'm listening to people. And this presentation was so impressive and it was so sprawling that every time I started drifting into one space, I was like, okay, I think I've got an idea. And then someone else went up to the mic and I was pulled over there. So it's a long-winded way of saying, I don't have something that I feel ties it all together. There were a bunch of things you folks cited that certainly resonate. So I'll try to take 3 steps back and see if I can get a wide angle lens on it. But one big thing, and it's a fixation of mine now, because for the last 4 years, I've been really focused on one fleet in particular, the Chinese distant water fleet. And so maybe I'm seeing everything through that lens. But one question that's begged, that's a big question that sort of is an umbrella to all of what you did is, which fleet are we talking about? Like all these systemic ideas, critiques, solutions are good, but they only kind of live or die based on who we're talking about. Because if we're talking about China, then a lot of these things simply don't work, because it's a very different type of interlocutor, and their fleet and how that fleet operates, which happens to be the biggest fleet on the planet by a factor of 10, is its own beast. And so I do think these are really good thoughts, but it would really help me to process them, to think, okay, when we're dealing with the Taiwanese fleet or the South Korean fleet or the Chilean fleet or the Chinese fleet, how are these things different? Whether it's you're using EU or US government mechanisms or whether you're applying pressure on companies. So that's one big question I sort of lob back at you smart people that did all this. The other thing, and this is a point that Anne and I were talking about just a week ago on the phone, and you all touched on it, but I kind of want to resurface it, is this notion that there is this, and forgive me, Anne, because you'll have heard this spiel before, but there is this dangerous sleight of hand that I think exists and occurs as the likes of folks in this room interface with the rest of the world. So the fish nerds and the nerds in this room try to talk to the normal people outside that aren't that versed in this stuff. And when industry comes in, there's this sort of rhetorical sleight of hand that occurs that I think it's beholden to all of us to like call and say, wait, slow that down, and let's call that really carefully. And that sleight of hand is the rhetorical maneuver, in which you ask a question about X and you get an answer about Y, and they're subtle. You ask a question about human rights and labor, and you get an answer that's about environmental or traceability. And unless you're really shrewd and aggressive and stop it right there, on they go, the conversation goes, and that slippage completely changes the game. And I think like we all have to start calling that like the minute it happens, because for too long, and what I mean by that is you ask company X or government Y, their major concerns on these boats, dead guys, berry, rate, wage theft, on and on, debt bondage, fee structure. What do you have to say about it? Whether it's the government, whether it's the shipping company, the fishing company, whether it's the downstream buyer, whoever you're talking to. And they come back at you with a whole bunch of rhetoric about MSC or processing plants or traceability. And if you're not really clever and aggressive, you let them keep going, and they just flood you with words, and off you go into and I think like that is one of the most consequential things that happens in this card game we're playing with these folks that we've got to call like right away and say, okay, hold on, let's back up. Like, I'm talking about crimes that are happening on the ships in international waters that are aimed at human beings. You're telling me stuff about things you do in the processing plant that have to do with fish fraud or traceability or, IUU even, all important issues, but not what I just asked you about. And so please, could we get back to here? And I think I know I'm a journalist, so I think in the realm of arguments and rhetoric and conversations and pressure and not systemic, legal mechanisms and what you folks are working on. But I think we're in the same tribe, and I think that a huge part of what you folks should also be doing in the analysis of your report and such is really thinking hard and confronting the public messaging and the rhetorical sleight of hand and the, kind of rhetoric from industry and those sorts on this stuff that essentially win the game for them, even before we've suited up and gotten on the field, because they've just tricked us into a conversation about why. And when we get out to the realm of the public writ large, whether it's on the pages of newspapers or magazines or in settings like this, I think making sure we constantly tell the public that we are going to talk about certain types of crimes. And then the last thing I'll say, again, it's adjacent. It's not completely on point, but it's sort of adjacent to what you folks are saying is, there are a bunch of really worthy solutions. I tried to capture some of them: published vessel lists, stop fees, Wi-Fi, electronic contracts, gender focus. So I think these are on a list of the 20 things that if tomorrow we could implement, huge problems would go away. My personal opinion is that, having done this for a little while, is that because of the distinct nature, it's different from a garment factory in Bangladesh or, a cobalt mine and wherever, the seafood space and the high seas realm is unlike any other workplace. And not just in the obvious ways, where it resides, the migrant transient nature of the workplace, et cetera, flags of convenience and on and on. It's also the nature of the handoff of the good, so I'm talking about transshipment here and reefers. And so that's the other thing, the supply chain, and really focusing on who the players are, be they governments or market players, that are the facilitators, the key facilitators of the handoffs, and how they are equally culpable, maybe even more culpable. Because if we're honest and we do that, you start getting Ecuador, Peru, Uruguay, you get certain port players that are facilitating crimes, even though in the press they're raising holy hell, they're actually like servicing the entire industry to make it all possible offshore. And so I think the mechanisms that you guys have in the report should also really be looking at the facilitators that allow the supply chain to do what it does, which is decentralize culpability. So.
Thank you for that. So both Ian's comments and Anne's comments really resonate. And I appreciate Anne's conclusion about, we need more signaling up front so that then before the sanctions happen, there's been a lot of effort to make change. I think that heads in the direction of the hybrid that Victoria was talking about. But Ian, your 3 points really resonate. I was in Indonesia in December, and I had the chance to meet with a migrant fisher who had gone to sea, gone through the whole recruitment process that the team has diagrammed up there. And I'm working with NGOs that are tracking the government monitoring of recruitment agencies. And we talked to the fisher, and the fisher says, okay, I got beaten up by the captain. They left me at port in Peru, and I was repatriated, and I made no money for the 6 months I was at sea. He didn't know what his contract was. He knew it was clear he'd been swindled. And we asked him, what are you going to do next? And he said, hope for better luck next time. And so that's when I started thinking, wait a minute, we need a different incentive structure, which came back to the amazing research this group has done to figuring out what does it mean to trace your labor supply chain. I spent a lot of time looking at seafood traceability, and it does not really get us all that far. So I think that is very much in line with the sleight of hand concept. I mean, the amount of effort that's been wasted on trying to figure out what of the environmental traceability helps the labor rights. And the students really wanted to work on both environment and labor, and I support that, but I don't think there's the full overlap, and we need to really look at that labor supply chain. One of the things that came up for the students on that whole incentive structure is the beneficial ownership piece that Connor talked about, and this whole thing of the EPP. I don't know if one of you wants to comment on that, but the employer pays principal companies commit to it, but not quite. And so it's not going as far as we'd like it to go. And there's so much more that we could say, but figuring out that public messaging, figuring out how we move from looking at not just tracing vessels, but then the beneficial ownership, which I think maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, that would start to get to the fleet, which fleet, correct? And I'm looking at Ian and Connor and Heather, Kelsey, and Kylie, but I believe that would get us to which fleet?
That being what?
The beneficial ownership database of Triton. But again, the point being, if you just start tracing the vessels and you don't publish the vessel lists, you could end up having a situation that we've had in apparel where the multinational just walks away. And so we have to figure out all these pieces together. I want to open it up to questions and comments. I'm seeing Marina Colby here, who's worked on this for a long time, and Noor Hamday, who's also worked on human rights due diligence and been advising the group.
I have a comment. Can I ask? Oh, sure. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to this great readout on the research. My name is Marina Colby, and I'm currently working at USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, and worked very closely with Anne at USDOL before I rejoined USAID, and definitely supported Ian's work before he published his wonderful Outlaw Oceans book. So pleased to see everyone here today. And just what I've been thinking about in terms of the comments from Anne and Ian and the sort of rhetorical maneuvering, I was jotting some notes. And one thing that I think is really interesting from the approach that you all laid out today, I love the sort of top down, bottom up. And from USAID, I very much take that bottom up development perspective approach, and really looking and keeping, my focus in this complex development challenge on the workers. And I think Ian made a really great point in terms of which workers, which vessels helps us identify the types of workers and the situations in which they're working under and the situations in which they are employed. So in that labor supply chain, we really need to investigate, as you all did, how are workers learning about these positions, and how do they get from their home to the vessel. That's fascinating. And there's some new research that the International Labor Organization and others are doing on those recruitment and labor pathways to the vessel. And then the type of vessel really matters, and the flag of the vessel really matters. But in terms of the sort of some of the language maneuvering that I hear is around really trying to skirt the accountability, trying to skirt the responsibility for labor and employment conditions. And I'm going to focus on the distant water fishing fleets. And that's like one of the comebacks that I often hear is, well, there needs to be better regulation. There needs to be better, the state needs to do more. Governments need to do more. But we all know that labor inspections don't really reach the high seas. So there's a big challenge there in terms of how labor rights are being respected at sea. So, I think, right now, the longer term sort of solutions that you laid out in terms of like the law and policy, that's going to be longer term, but of course we want short-term wins. And that I think is really from that development perspective and keeping the eyes on what are the worker, that bringing out that worker voice, the worker needs. When you talk to these fish workers, they really, they want to be like every worker, they want to be paid, right? They want to work in like fair and safe conditions. So the more we can work with the CSOs and the trade unions and those that are supporting the workers, the more we can learn about the challenges and continue to voice and support their needs and their stories, and then have this, and I think it really is, it's really informing public policy. It's informing the due diligence. So I just wanted to mention that. And then the remedy, like keeping the focus on the remedy, on how workers who are exploited or treated badly or not paid, just ensuring that those remedies, that there are solutions there. And so that's very much that bottom-up development perspective. And then, the more we can stop just talking to ourselves all the time, but including these NGOs, including these workers themselves, the representatives, I think we're starting to do that more and more. And I would also ask, like someone brought up the situation of Thai Union that was starting to do directly hiring people, and then sort of moved away, I think you found in your research, maybe because it cost too much. And that made me think, like, there's a calculation, right, going on there that we have to like incentivize the direct hire more than going through these recruitment agencies when everyone knows that there's more room for exploitation during that recruitment process versus a direct hire. So somehow these companies, they're making calculations that the chances for exploitation and the cost is, they're willing to deal with that rather than directly hiring workers. So thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Yeah, I'd love you to give it to Noor, who was right next to you, because I know Noor has been thinking quite a lot about what Marina's talking about and probably other things that we went over.
Yeah, is this on? Oh,
sorry.
no, it's okay.
Say where.
Okay, yeah, no, I got it now. Well, first of all, thank you all, and thank you for this amazing report. I think it's incredible, and I really appreciate all your presentations. I think what I would want to go back to is the discussion on the legal section that Victoria gave. I think I think there are a couple of things that are relevant from ICAR's perspective. The first is that Victoria mentioned the multiple kind of sanctions or the instruments that the US has to hold fishers accountable for forced labor on their vessels. And I think that I think the wins that you mentioned, like, for example, the global Magnitsky sanctions against Dalian are huge and really important. And what's relevant from our perspective is having all of those different agencies and all those different mechanisms working together to share information. So kind of making sure that when one enforcement action is taken, that information can be shared with another agency that can take another enforcement action. And so that requires a lot of collaboration between the Seafood Import Monitoring Program and Customs and Border Patrol and OFAC to kind of make sure that multiple enforcement actions are taken to result in stronger accountability against particular perpetrators. And then I think the second thing that I wanted to bring up was the recommendation that you gave, that Victoria, that sort of combining the US kind of sanctions blunt instrument approach with the EU approach. And I think that's really key for kind of supply chain accountability in US courts, because I think we are lacking kind of that large kind of the accountability for supply chains across the board and kind of making change longer term, whereas I think the EU might be lacking some of that like blunter instruments. And I think this is something that ICAR has kind of been thinking through from our perspective in terms of what human rights due diligence might look like in the US. And I think from our perspective, we've kind of turned to what the corruption movement looks like. So for example, Ian, you mentioned that a lot of companies, when you talk about human rights, turn to environment. And I think that the same thing applies across the board. When you talk about human rights, folks also bring up corruption instead. And you see that a lot with accountability, where, for example, a company might have engaged in corruption, but then they also have a large amount of gross human rights abuses under their belts, and they might receive a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act fine, but then won't be fined or won't have any cases go through regarding their human rights impacts. And so I think from our perspective, we've kind of looked to the corruption movement to think about how can we mirror that in the human rights space. So how can we make sure that the same accountability mechanism also applies in human rights? And so from ICAR's perspective, that's kind of the way that we've wanted to combine the EU and the US approach, which is to develop a FCPA that would apply for human rights impacts, where it would apply across supply chains and kind of hold companies account and results in that sanction for companies that don't comply or that violate, but then also create access to remedy for workers who are impacted. So I just wanted to highlight those two things.
Did you want to comment on that or no? Yeah.
Yeah, we've been.
Thank you for that. Maybe next year we can talk. We can dig into that when you've got it more. As I mentioned, they've been doing sort of live updates on these laws as they move forward. Kylie, do you want to share something from online or turn it on so somebody can speak from the online audience?
Yeah, I think Kirill has a question online. So you're more than welcome to unmute.
Really, you're my hero for staying up so late. I had.
Hello, I don't know if you can hear me well. Yep. Okay, good. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And indeed, I'm joining you from Europe, and it's a deep night here. But I thought I will not miss the chance to join this interesting presentation. First of all, I'm working in the International Trade Union Organization. We represent the workers in the seafood sector. The IUF, the International Union of Food Workers, we just recently had the conference where we brought together the workers from 30 countries, those who are organized to fight for a better life and better working conditions for themselves. And I'm the coordinator for this seafood workers division within IUF. I have to say that we are one of 10 global union federations, and we represent only the food processing and food and fish farming sector. We work in strategic partnership with the ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, which represent the fishers and the fishermen, those people who catch the fish. First of all, I would like to thank you all deeply from the deepest part of my heart for spending your time and your effort in doing this research. On behalf of our members, we believe that this sector, which is playing a crucial role in feeding the population of the planet, and where the working conditions are so miserably poor, and so dangerous and so bad, there is a need for bigger attention to what is happening in this area. And what you do is actually bringing more light on this shadow economy, which is so extremely important. And our members are really grateful to all of you for that. I just want to say a few things to complicate a bit the picture and probably give you some ideas for further areas of research, and maybe also to give you an idea that actually we're not yet that big in initiating this movement. First of all, I think we need to be more clear about the definitions. This panel in this event is called seafood, or is using the seafood supply chain, seafood value chain. But if we look seriously at the seafood supply chain, we will find out easily that most of the seafood is now coming not from the fishing vessels. It's a farmed seafood. It's grown seafood. There's a huge sector of fish farming, the marine farming, inland farming, ponds in the rivers. There are so many people employed in this sector, and most of them, they're contracted by big multinational companies, and they supply this seafood to the international market. We shall not leave these people out of the picture. And in fact, according to the statistics of the FAO, this part of the seafood sector will be growing because there is not too much fish is left in the ocean to feed the growing appetite of the growing population. So the aquaculture and fish farming will very soon dominate the sourcing of fish and seafood to the plates of the people. So it is important that we keep them in the picture. Not the fish processing workers should not be forgotten as well. Their situation is also very difficult. It's difficult to compare it to of course, to what is happening on the fishing vessels, especially in the high seas. But our approach and our view of this is that we have to look at the sector in general. We shall be focusing on the question on who is actually profiting, who is benefiting from this miserable situation of these workers, from the slavery, from the child labor, from so many deaths at sea. At the end of the day, this business is mega profitable. If you look at the accounts of the seafood companies, you will be surprised. Probably you will not be surprised to see how profitable it is. And if we don't focus on these people and on these structures, which is actually interested to invest more and more in keeping the situation as it is and keeping the business as usual, then we may miss a point and we will not be able to reach a result. So we need to study how this whole business is operating. Multinational corporations, which are growing now in the seafood industry, they will most probably have the elements of all the supply chain which you drafted on your picture. They will have the fishing vessels, they will have fishing farms, fish processing, and fish distribution. There's huge restaurants, seafood restaurant chains, 5,000 restaurants serving sushi food, employing thousands of workers. These workers are also seafood workers. So the seafood, if we use this word, seafood supply chain, we have to look at all of these categories of workers. And we shall also look at where are the centers of profits, who is actually benefiting from that, and how they're withdrawing these profits from the sector. After all, this is also, the seafood is the most traded food commodity. And most of it goes to the world market, through a very few gates where these companies are selling the product and signing the contract. These are the seafood expos. And I had an honor to be at the recent Barcelona Seafood Expo, and some of you were at Boston Seafood Expo recently to look at actually how wealthy is this sector and how wealthy are these companies. And these are also the proper places to ask actually in Barcelona, the Global Seafood Expo. It's an open gate to the market of European Union for all these companies. And when we look at the list of the companies and we point at some of them which have a record of violation of human rights and workers' rights, you have to ask yourself, why, for God's sake, these companies are so easily trading to Europe? Why all these companies, all the American companies which are using Boston Seafood Expo to sell their product to the North American market, and we know some of them are quite heavily and deeply involved in violation of human rights and violating of the ILO standards in other countries. Why is that so easy for them? So the third area for the research, I will say, which is crucial, is how can we make sure that these markets are protected from the product, from the entry of the product which is tainted with human rights violations. This is not difficult to do. It's a question of political will. And again, thank you very much for spending your knowledge, your intelligence, your time, your energy and passion, because I feel even on a big distance that there is a lot of energy in the room where you are now. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you, Kirill. That is, yeah, thank you. That's just great. Spoken like a true organizer. So I think between you and Ian, we're going to build like more cadres of people working on this issue. Do we have more comments in the chat? I know there are a bunch of people. No questions, no comments. Okay, so I would love to ask if the students want to add some comments. I mean, there's been a lot said, and I know it must have triggered some of your thoughts around things like the sleight of hand, which we've talked about and not phrased that way, but other ways. So I want to just open it up if he wants to comment. Sure.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Mullen. I was on the corporate team. Amazing points. I'm writing away over here. Amazing points, Ian, about which fleet are we talking about? I think it was very important that I think Kirill just brought up, of course, the aqua farming and fish farming, because in CBOS, the pre-competitive platform that we looked at is mostly aquaculture companies. And so definitely fishing vessels, distant water fishing vessels is not on their top priority, really. And so it's more so an even deeper, a step to be like, okay, you have your fish feed, which fish feed is, some of it is sourced from the fish. So that's a whole other, level of transparency that is difficult to get at. So I think those just very, very important parts to come up, and mostly also going to the different aspects of the supply chain, like the processing. I think that's also why we wanted to incorporate the gender lens, is because 50% of the workforce of the seafood supply chain, I think you can correct me, Sloan, is women. And then those women are dominated in processing plants as well as shallow water fishing. So it's very much we need to have a holistic view of it, but the as we're all talking about, it is a very, very, very large picture. With processing, with aquaculture and everything. So I've just really appreciated everyone's comments, because it has helped provide context to the issue that we are trying to all focus on and look at. And then one thing is just kind of pointing at this transparency issue. We interviewed the World Benchmarking Alliance because they do a seafood stewardship index, and a really big thing of it was, and I think Marina even brought it up in one of our the law, another law school, AU law school seafood thing, and of how World Benchmarking Alliance and other voluntary corporate, how inconsistent it all is, because then we have all of these benchmarking, all of these measurements, all of these gradings going on, but then it's like other other third parties are grading companies based on just what companies provide their information on. It's all public source information. So you can get a good grade depending on what you put out there. So essentially, I think Marina was talking about, and then when we talked to World Benchmarking Alliance as well, essentially saying, yes, Thai Union's number one, but that's when you actually look at it, they are 50 out of 100, of their grading scale. And then when you look on their, actually go deeper dive in there, sorry, I got choked up on the pun. It's like, when you actually go deeper dive on it, then you look on the website, it's like human rights, labor issues is the number one thing that they all of them got terrible scores on, and they got great scores on traceability and things like that. So essentially just saying all of these other metrics and measurements out there that are trying to measure these companies based on companies' public information also give a skewed view of the landscape of how well companies are doing. As well as, it's only grading on transparency, not even really grading on their human rights aspects of the companies. And with that, I can pass it on to Sam, I guess.
To Marina's point, I just wanted to clarify one thing too. So for the Thai Union case study, they initially were partnering with Myanmar recruitment agencies that were vetted by Thai Union themselves, but they were putting the initiation out by saying, we are hiring basically in Myanmar. So it was kind of saying, use our vetted recruitment agencies, impacted a third-party assessment. It was like a consulting firm. So we can take that with a grain of salt, but they did see that people felt generally safer through the recruitment process, and they paid on average less than going through other recruiters. However, I think this is back to the point where initially Thai Union is saying, we are fully in support of the EPP, or the employer pays principle, and then started to backtrack that due to the cost. So it could have been potentially a lot better, but I just wanted to make that clarifying point. The second one is kind of that intersection of human rights and environmental due diligence. Talking with someone with, I won't say CSO, they make a good point that saying there's implementation in Fiji of these e-monitoring programs on vessels, and spent X amount of time, energy, and money implementing these to monitor fish for environmental purposes. But with that forethought of having that intersection between environment and the human rights, they could have gone a step further to have some sort of system that could have allowed for grievance mechanisms on board vessels. So this huge implementation of monitoring programs could have had a small section that looked at the workers on board these vessels as well. And that's where I like to reiterate the point that there has to be cross discussion and listening between the environment and the human rights people, because without that, these big gaps and these big misses can happen where it could be maybe a little bit more simple and a little bit more effective to implement on these vessels. So.
Anything else from the legal team? I know that to Anne's point about needing clear rules, and just to Heather's point on your pun, I have to say I've been trying to offer to give extra credit for everybody who makes a seafood pun, and some of them have gotten really good at it, but I'm not allowed to give extra credit. But nor when you were speaking, what it really made me think of is there's basically this constructed activist net, and all these regulations work together. But that also brings me to another frustration, which is the more mechanisms we create, the more we expect civil society to do the legwork to make them function. And so if there were some way to create fewer, stronger, clear rules for companies and get them to do better, that would be helpful, because we're just, I think the French case that was thrown out, it was once the jurisdiction got decided, the NGOs needed to have re-upped their complaint, and they didn't. Well, okay, but maybe had they done it, it would have been different. And so some of this is just the growing pains of these laws coming into existence, but some of it's also needing like more resources for that to happen. I have some other experts in the audience. I'm hoping they might want to chime in on strategies here.
Can I throw in one thing?
Yes, please. And I know to your point about the 20 different things we could identify, the Fishery Governance Project, actually, I have a call tomorrow morning, is in the process of trying to hone what are the asks we're asking of companies. And to be clear, the companies keep complaining the NGOs ask too many things. But that's just the nature of this. That's just the way companies are going to complain. And I think we need to start with a list of 10 that's not a definitive list and then keep building out from there. But please, by all means, Ian, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the struggles I have kind of mentally in processing something so broad is often the way I work is the exact opposite, where I'm attempting to go extremely deep and then use that, well, which is a narrative well, and it's one dead guy, right? That you track from start to finish for 4 years as synecdoche for the big picture. And so I struggle to operate up where you guys are. And my brain wants to keep going back to, okay, could I get anchored by one story, which will just probably not include some of the terrain up top that you guys have created, but it will anchor many of the issues in a concrete way. So sorry for the long-winded wind up, but so when I was listening to you, I was thinking back on a lot of the cases that I'm working on now and thinking back of, okay, so in the scenarios that play out, which are fairly standard, guy goes from country X, typically a migrant, to country Y, gets on a ship, off they go. And again, I'm not talking about all these other important routes. I'm not talking about fishmongers. I'm not talking about processing plants. I'm talking about distant water fishing vessel labor issues. And, the crime scene is typically on the vessel. Some crimes occur even before the guy gets there, the ones we talk about. The really bad stuff happens on the vessel. And then the consequential other bad stuff happens after, like blacklisting and, sort of the peace agreements that get signed and foreclose a lot of these options to begin with because they've signed an NDA and all these sorts of things. If you track one case of that's sort of a standard case, where are the places that make a lot of these mechanisms hard to apply? And so that's one big question that I have. And the other question I have is so at the end of the day, who is applying the pressure and who are they applying it on? In my simplistic outlook, the prize target it's probably advocates or lawyers or journalists or a bunch of them together applying pressure on behalf of one case. And they're probably applying it, in my outlook, if we really want to get outcomes, on the companies, and the companies are probably not in Indonesia or Taiwan or China, the buyers, because these other folks don't care, about AU or the New York Times or the New Yorker or whatever, me. So you have no real impact, USAID, and these folks can do some things, but like if you're really trying to go for a case, then I suppose I see the cases as ones in which you're trying to apply pressure. Maybe it's about a fleet, maybe it's about one ship, maybe it's about one dead guy or one wage theft case or whatever. And you're probably applying pressure on those who actually feel pressure. And that's probably going to be the buyers downstream. Who in the middle might help you. Maybe they're governments, maybe they're lawyers, maybe they're journalists. Those are the soldiers in between that are going to apply the pressure. But to me, it seems like really thinking concretely, yes, changing the rules of the game, changing the rhetoric, the sleight of hand, changing public awareness, changing policies, great. But in terms of case outcomes, I think really focusing on who are you applying the pressure, who's going to apply it, and what tools do they have to do so, and where are there crazy disconnects where you can put in all this effort and then you hit the peace agreement, right? In Indonesia with a manning agency that's not even registered on the federal level, and the Indonesian government's not answering Marina or me or you or anyone. They're just saying, who are you? I've just been dealing with one just today, and we've got insane evidence, autopsy reports, footage, everything. Took it to the manning agency just today. They wrote back 3 lines. These guys had no complaints. Of course, they signed a peace agreement. So the guys told me all sorts of complaints on record. But so I would just say, I don't know, that I guess my point is for all the merit and breadth, I would also say, dropping some real deep wells on depth and looking at where in a typical case the real disconnects are, the reefers, the peace agreements, the fact that SIMP does not, the US government and its tracking, you can't figure out it's Red Lobster and Walmart that's taking that stuff because the data isn't there to connect to the processing plant in Thailand or China. And that's a US government problem, and that's a data problem, that's a trade problem. So like figuring out where are the 7 disconnects that make it impossible to get the dead guy and a company to change its behavior that's connected. Where are the big gaps along the way? And then honing in on those, that's only by doing a deep well dive, not a broad analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's super helpful, I think, for future efforts. And it speaks to a little bit of where Kirill was going with this discussion as well. And I don't know if Kirill's still online, but one of the things that we're trying to look at within the Fishery Governance Project is how do we get to more national initiatives and support fishery worker driven solutions for those in processing and aquaculture. And I know the International Transport Federation is doing some looking at the possibility of worker driven social responsibility, but we're also starting to map more and more organizing where it's not just between the Fishers Trade Union and the vessel, but then also the manning agency, because they've got to become part of this linking. There's Kirill. So I don't know if you want to add to this discussion of going deeper and doing more focus on the fisher perspective and organizing.
Sorry.
My bad. Fishery workers. We're going to start using that term.
Well, I just want to say it's important. We're talking about the recommendations, the practical recommendations for the companies. We need to really recognize that they operate in different parts of and different segments of the value chain. So in practical terms, if we want the company to lease their vessels, we need them also to lease all the processing facilities. And we need them to also lease the farms where they source from. And we also need them to lease the restaurants and the distribution networks they're using. That will be then a proper way for us to analyze the whole chain and see how we can make sure that the human life of the seafood worker costs a little bit more than the life of a sardine or mackerel.
Thank you. I think, do we have one more question online? And then I'd love to turn it over to Anne and Ian and any of the students if you have any additional concluding remarks or just other questions that you really want to have answered before the night's out.
We do have one question from the chat from Judith. She said, I would like to hear more about Ian's work on Chinese distant water fishing vessels. I know he's expressed frustrations that answers don't address the questions. I'd like to know if he's publishing anything new on Chinese fleets.
Can you tell me which Judith this is?
Judith Shapiro.
Okay.
She teaches Chinese.
I thought it was Judith. Okay. Yeah. So, I could go on and on. I mean, so we spent 4 years and we were trying to sort of take a look at the black box that is China and that is the distant water fishing fleet. Not with some assumption that they were necessarily worse, but that they were certainly more opaque and bigger. And there were real worrisome signs. We then honed it in on, okay, well, which portion of the distant water fishing fleet of China you're going to really look at, because you can't take it all. So we focused on squid for lots of reasons. The squid fleet is, in terms of tonnage brought on land, it's the biggest portion of what China lands, and the squid fleet has a huge number of ships in a lot of really interesting places: North Korea, High Seas Falklands, High Seas Galapagos, Yemen. So a good target in that sense. And then our goal was to just sort of take a look deeply at what's the broader agenda. Well, where is the fleet and what is it up to? To what degree can we shed light on human rights and labor concerns, and especially post-COVID when China switched away from foreign labor, Chinese on Chinese labor concerns, huge trafficking concerns within China, rural inland being trafficked to Shidao and Shandong province, and really deep dive on how that migrant flow works. So getting on Chinese vessels, we got on Chinese vessels, which has not been done before, and spent time and had quite an awakening interviewing directly Chinese deckhands, and then also the myriad IUU concerns of this fleet in a bunch of different places, and other kind of China projection of power thoughts, kind of China is doing what the US has done before and other great superpowers have done, in that it's trying to grow its influence and presence and power. And to what degree is that broadening of Chinese power happening on the water? And to what degree is it happening not through Navy and Coast Guard, but through Chinese fleet? What food security concerns off the coast of West Africa look like? What do Chinese civil militia, supposed fishing vessels in the South China Sea look like? Really looking broadly at the big question of China power as exerted through its distant water fishing fleet. So it's a big target and took us forever, and we're still not done. But and then the last thing, probably the thing that took it the longest, was this thing I was grumpy, and talking about connecting the dots to people that actually you can access. So how do you get the crimes to the EU-US brands, and connecting the supply chain dots from bait to plate? And that's brutal for all the reasons that Bob Stumberg in the audience and others have worked on, which is these massive disconnects from commingling of the catch on the fishing vessel, on the reefers, to commingling and opaqueness from the port to the truck to the processing plant, completely dark. You got to have boots on the ground in Shidao following the trucks, which is ridiculous. And that's what we did, but we could only do it, for a couple of companies before it got dangerous. All the steps that you would need to go to connect crimes, IUU, human slavery, all the way to brands, consumers, the US government buying squid, for public school lunch, prisons, army bases, huge Cisco, Red Lobster, all these folks are all taking things from these vessels, but because of plausible deniability and the convenience that globalization allows, they can't tell you where it's actually coming from and some of the companies we're dealing with have given us their published list. And we know for a fact that those published lists are like 20 vessels, and we know that they're being serviced by 70 because of watching the transfer of catch from vessels to the same reefers owned by the same company and then taken to the processing plants. So that's what we have done with China, and the plan is to release all this reporting sometime this calendar year. I hope that answers the question.
I see Judy came on camera. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, I don't know. First, I just want to, I'm a huge fan, Ian, and I know your father sort of, I actually interpreted it a long case that he presided over. So, but I guess I think there must be allies inside of China, in civil society, and I'd love to talk with you sometime about those possible allies. I mean, you can think about what Yao Ming and Wild Aid have done on shark finning, for example. I mean, they've completely changed the market. So I think there is a large population inside of China that would be pretty horrified to know what happens on those ships. But anyway, you do great work, and I'm so proud of all the students here and to be part of this conversation. So I'm going to mute myself now.
I get the sense that the students know you well. I'll tell my dad you said hello. My dad. I think you make a good point. And again, it's something that we aspired and still aspire to do differently with this reporting. One is to be really aggressive in policing ourselves about the Western media and government and rhetoric that allows laziness when it comes to China bashing, and really thinking hard about fairness in how we talk about China, even if they are a culprit, which they are hugely, they're also a scapegoat. And one of the pieces, which we're trying to get our partners, our newspaper partners to accept if they're going to take the whole newspaper series, is a piece that just looks at the way that the Western media and the US government leverages this whole, issue to their own advantage. China is the biggest and in many measures the worst actor out there, but they're also too easily associated with things. So that's point one. Point two is thinking hard about, is there any way for us to actually get a hearing inside China with these? And we haven't cracked the code on how to do that yet. One notion was if we could partner with players. There's a law firm we're working with outside the US that knows how to operate in China and sort of how to take our findings and try to sand them down into terms that won't trigger, a shutdown, but nonetheless don't pull punches, and then submit those findings within China to its Distant Water Fisheries Association, and see what happens. What's interesting is a lot of the illegalities, the big categorical illegalities that we found, some of them are actually violations of Chinese law. So AIS darkness a year ago became illegal for the distant water fishing fleet. We've got huge numbers of Chinese vessels that are dark for 3 weeks as they head towards Ecuador. So hopefully the Chinese government on stuff like that, IUU, which is the easier pill for them to swallow, they will hear it, and take it. The labor stuff, it's a third rail. And everyone we talk to, all the labor stuff, all the human rights stuff, we've got Uyghur, we've got North Korean, we've got it all. Like that stuff we know. There's no way you can diplomatically frame that's going to get a hearing inside China. And we've talked with law professors, judges at NYU who've left China, and they said, that's going to completely, they're not going to touch it. They're going to immediately say this is US China bashing, et cetera. Just that's too volatile a topic. And that's 80% of what we're focused on. So, but I would love to hear if anyone has ideas on how we could get this stuff circulating and heard in China, including especially the labor stuff.
Well, I definitely think there's several conversations to continue here, and I'm seeing Andy Hickman's comments in the chat, which means he also is up very late in the UK, and we should be thanking Andy for everything he did to facilitate our contact with the Sea Alliance members and their commitment to try and be transparent and engaged on this topic. So we're excited to continue that collaboration. And if Ann Zollner is still on, I wanted to see if she had any concluding remarks. But I think there's so much here. I really take the deep dive. Meredith Lopuk is the coordinator of the Fishery Governance Project. I'm hoping if she's saying thank you, but it would be great if she actually comes on camera and says something.
in her pajamas. For a reason.
It's on the West Coast. Well, in Colorado.
Hey, Judy. Hi, class. I just wanted to quickly say thank you to all of you for the impressive work that you've done over the term and for the presentation today. I think there was a lot of very insightful points that you've made and that all of the speakers have shared throughout the course of the evening. That is going to give the Fishery Governance Project quite a bit to consider and work on and talk about over the coming weeks and months and years. So that's really all I wanted to do this evening, was just share a huge thank you to all of you and to Judy for leading the class.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Meredith, for guiding us and helping us with this work. So I'm not sure Anne's going to join us again, because I think
I'm on, Judy. Just thank you. I mean, just thank you for us. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah. I wanted to ask if you have any concluding remarks. We're going to wrap up.
Oh, sure. I was just going to say thank you as well. I mean, this is broad and spanning, but it fits so nicely and timely with a lot of the different kind of initiatives that are underway, including like the Calm Seas initiative that includes private sector as well as a cross range of USG agencies. So we will, and it affirms a lot of what we've been doing and looking at. So we will look to continue our coordination with you and this group. But thank you very much, and as well as with Ian and Marina and all the other folks on this call that I see are colleagues in this important space.
Thank you again, Anne, and thank you, Ian and Sloan and Connor and Victoria, Matthew, Sam, Carla, Kylie, Heather, Kelsey, Olivia, Soo-hyun. Thank you all for all your work, and thank you everybody for coming. I know we have a lot more people online than we do in the room, so I have more food than necessary because I couldn't tell who was going to be here in person or not. But we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.